Hello friends, welcome to the next episode of DotVVM Minutes. Today I will be playing with Composite controls and I will show you how to integrate third-party JavaScript components into your applications. Recently I needed a simple date picker component and I have found Easepick, which is a very nice and lightweight and tiny JavaScript plugin or JavaScript library which can turn the plain HTML input into this calendar experience. Of course, today in the browsers we have just the input type equals date, but this is a bit nicer. It has a lot of plugins. It can select date ranges and things like that. So I would like to show you how to integrate this component into .vvm. And we will be using the new approach, which is called Composite controls. So I will write a Composite controls and knockout binding handler, which will integrate this into the MVVM binding experience. So if I go to this page, I'm seeing the list of libraries. We will take the entire bundle because in the future maybe we will need some plugins for picking the time or for picking the ranges. So let's use this bundle. And if you look at the example how this component is used, it's very simple. It's input with some ID, and then they will just use the new easepick.create, pass the element found by this ID, and select some CSS styles. In .vvm, we are trying to avoid component IDs because this will prevent having this control appearing multiple times on the page. If you, for example, if you put such a control into a repeater and you would depend on exact specific IDs of components, then it would not work because when the control appears a second time on the screen, that would break. However, in a knockout, which is underneath .vvm, there is a very nice way to call this code for any element in the page once it will appear there. So we will implement this as a knockout binding handler, and because .vvm from the version 4.0, it's also built with modules. So I will be using module, and I would want to bundle this Easepick library together with my tiny little extension into knockout. So we will make a script which will include this library with the component and also the knockout binding handler. Here I have a page where I'm already using this control. So basically I want something like this experience. So I would say custom controls Easepick and select the date equals, and I want to bind a datetime or datetime nullable properties into this component. And also it would be pretty nice if the component can fire some event in case the value is changed by the user in this component. So I'm also using the changed event. As you can see in this little demo, I'm just incrementing some property. So that's just to indicate that the changed event was actually triggered. And here I have a text box which is bound to the same component because the data binding in .vvm is always two-way. So what we also want to make sure is that if someone else through some different component will change the date value bound to this control, then this control needs to respond to that. So this control needs to update its selected date to the same value. So no matter if I change the date here or here, the other control should be notified about this and it should respond to this change. This is the browser experience for selecting dates. Yeah, it's also quite nice in the recent versions of the browser, and it will work nice on the mobile devices as well. However, if you want to provide another experience thanks to this Easepick component, you can use this control. Yeah, so here I can select this value and you can see the changed event was triggered, so date changes is incremented, and also this value was propagated into the other control. If I will change the value here, you can see immediately it was changed also in this Easepick component, same as if I will pick the value from the calendar. However, this is still 1 because I didn't change the value through the component. I have just changed the underlying property in the view model, and the component, the Easepick, just like responded to that, but it wasn't changed through the Easepick, so the event was not triggered, which is a correct behavior. That's what I want, yeah, because the event handlers are bound not to a view model values, but to specific components. Yeah, it's an event of a component, not of a view model. So let's look how the Easepick component is implemented. It's pretty easy because the only thing we want to do is to render data bind equals Easepick and unchanged attribute. Before I will dig into the specific details of this, let's return to the browser and open the developer tools so you can see what is actually rendered for the Easepick. So I have rendered input element with data bind Easepick equals date. So the Easepick is the name of a knockout binding handler I will be implementing in a few minutes. And the onChange, it's a standard event handler, a standard code which DotVVM provides for every event handlers, and that's basically it. So whenever the value is changed in this input, this will be triggered. And also this read-only flag, but this was added by the Easepick control. I didn't render that, yeah, but it is added. From JavaScript from this control. Also, the control generated this Easepick wrapper. That's not what I generated. This was created by JavaScript by the control itself. If you want to see the real HTML which came to the browser, you don't need to use inspect. You can use page source, and here you would be able to see exactly what was sent from the server. So you can see there is only the input element with the unchanged and blah, 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 and that's it, nothing else. So the other things were generated from the JavaScript. That's the logic of the Easepick library. So this is pretty straightforward. If you haven't seen the composite controls, it's a new way of how to define components in .vvm. Basically, it's a class which inherits from the composite control, and it has a method which must be named getContents, including the casing. The name has to be exactly this, and it can return either a .vvm control or IEnumerable of .vvm controls, because the control can consist of multiple elements. And here your only goal is just to return a list of or one or more controls, .vvm controls, that represent this component. So it's great for like building components from other smaller components or some primitive things. The primitive object here is the HTML generic control, which just renders an HTML element. And I'm setting 2 attributes. First attribute is this data bind. Let's go back to it shortly. And the second attribute is onChange. And here is a condition: if this event handler, the changed event, is set, then I will use this helper function to generate that ugly piece of JavaScript which will trigger the command. Yeah, so generate client postback script and changed and the reference to the control. And if it's not set, I will pass null. These methods add attributes. They are working with null. If you provide null, it will not render anything. So it's very good if you are using this nullable things. Here, if it's null, the attribute will just not be rendered, because otherwise it would be empty and it would be like useless to render it. Here I wanted to compose a JavaScript object. If I return back to what was generated, because the data bind in a knockout, it has to be object where there is an key is the name of the binding handler and the value is the value which will be passed to the handler. So basically I need to render this, and I don't want to compose these JSON objects and braces by myself. So that's why I am using this helper knockout binding group object, and in this group I will add an Easepick, and I need to pass a binding, and here you cannot use just I-value binding of datetime. You need to call get knockout binding expression and pass the reference to the current control, so it would translate this binding to JavaScript in the correct context. So I've created this binding group, which is the JSON object with the Easepick and the date property, and I'm just adding it here. I need to call toString, which will serialize, which will spit out the JSON. So this is the server-side part. Basically, from each parameter of this getContents control, DotVVM will create a property which you can set on the control, and if you provide a default value for the property, it will not be required. So this is null, which means that this property is not required. If I don't set it in the markup, it will be null. Here, this one doesn't have a default value, so if I wouldn't set it here, DotVVM would complain and say, oh, you didn't set the required property because selected date doesn't have any default value, so DotVVM wouldn't know what to place inside. And the type of this property is actually I-value binding of datetime nullable, and it means that it must be a value binding. So the only thing you can write here is value binding, and the property or the resulting expression inside must be convertible to datetime nullable. In my case, it's just date. It's not datetime nullable, but it's convertible, like datetime value can be stored in a datetime question mark property. Yeah, so this is fine. And the remaining magic is happening here in this knockout binding handler Easepick. So first thing I need to do is to run npm clean install. So I'm using npm CI. This will look in the package JSON and it will restore all the packages. If you would say that there's the difference between npm install and npm clean install, the clean install will respect whatever is in this package log JSON. npm just normal install would regenerate this file. If there are some dependent packages or with newer versions, it could change them. That's what I don't want, so I'm using npm CI. It's a very nice shortcut. And if you look at these dependencies, what I have installed here, I have installed this Easepick bundle library, which is my component, which I'm going to integrate. I have installed TypeScript definitions for Knockout.js, and I have installed TypeScript. I've also installed .vvm types, which is a TypeScript type definitions for .vvm. And I have installed esbuild, which is my favorite module bundler, which I'm using in all my .vvm projects, and also we are using it at .vvm internally. So the JavaScript part of .vvm is built with esbuild. It's very simple configuration. You will just pass a bunch of TypeScript files, and it will bundle everything together into one script. I've also declared scripts here, so I have a development version, production version of the script. Here is .vvm easepick ts. This file I will take and I will bundle it in the ECMAScript module format and place it in the www root, so it's placed next to this file basically. I'm importing this component because I will be using it here, and I'm just creating this knockout binding handler. Yeah. So before we look how this actually works, let's just run npm run build dev, which will take the TypeScript version and it will produce this JavaScript. Yeah, so if you look at this TypeScript, I'm importing the Easepick and then defining my handler. If I will look here, you can see there is the entire Easepick library bundled together with my binding handler, which is here at the end of the file. Yeah, so it will bundle the library and my knockout binding handler together and return an ECMAScript module from that. So it would be pretty straightforward to use. So what I need to do to use this file is to register it in .vvm startup. So if you look here in the config resources, I'm calling config resources register script module. Its name is .vvm Easepick and the path is here. And I need to say that it's dependent on .vvm. So I want to load this script after .vvm would be initialized, because I'm depending on no code and also on some .vvm functions for converting date times into format which is used in the view model. Yeah, so this. And the last thing, this component, the getContents method, we have been here, but here on pre-render, I'm also saying whatever is using this component, it needs to include this .vvm Easepick resource. So whenever you use this component on a page, this module would be added automatically. Yeah? So this is now what we are doing here. So let's dig into the last file, and it's the binding handler. Every knockout binding handler has two methods. First is called init, and it will be called for every instance, for every element with the data bind attribute with the Easepick item. So for every element, no matter if I use it just once or 1,000 times on the page, for every instance, it would be called this init method. And the update method will be called whenever the value will change. So let's go back in the browser to see it once again. Whenever knockout find input data bind Easepick something, it will call the init method of the binding handler. And whenever this expression, this date property, would change its value, whenever you store a different value in this expression, the update method of the binding handler would be called. Yeah? And also for your convenience, this update method is called right after init once, just to be able to like look at the property and update the value for the first time. So whenever when the page is loaded, the one element with this data bind would be here. So the init would be called immediately when the page is being loaded. And after init, also update will be called once. And then, if anyone changes the date property, the update would be called once again and over for every change of this property. So the workflow is typically for integrating any JavaScript components is this. In the init phase, you will instantiate this component. So I'm calling the Easepick create. I'm not using element IDs. I don't have to, because I will get the element right here as a first parameter of this knockout binding handler. So I will just pass this element to the control. I don't need it to have any kind of ID or anything like that. This is just the style which will be used for the calendar. You can also like put it as part of your application. I didn't make a parameter for this, no worries. And also this component can adjust its user interface based on the language culture which we will be using. So I'm calling .vvm get culture, which will return the culture the user has currently set. Like on the server for the request that created this page. So this is what I'm initializing the picker. And then when some value in this picker is selected, I need to write it in the view model. Yeah. So whenever the user selects something, I will call this value accessor, which will evaluate the expression in the binding handler. So let's go back to the DevTools. It will evaluate this date expression. So like this will get evaluated. It's a knockout observable. So it is basically a function. And if you call it without any parameters, it will return the value. If you call it with one parameter, it will write the value in the observable. But if there would be some more complex expression, knockout would just evaluate this expression, which we will put here. So that's pretty straightforward. So now we have this property, and if it would be some calculated expression like date1 plus date2, we cannot write the value in that expression, because like you don't know which one would you need to update. If it's a calculated value, we cannot do anything. We can just present the date to the user. But if the user selects something, like, sorry, we cannot. We don't know how to propagate this thing in the view model. But if it's an observable, and if it's writable, if KO is writable, observable says, yes, I'm an observable, and you can write value in me, then that's what we will do. So in this property, I'm calling it with one parameter, and I will take eDetailDate, which is this parameter of this event. So eDetailDate is the selected date. And because .vvm is storing dates in the view model in a special way, I need to convert this date using this .vvm serialization serialize date. There is also a reverse function, .vvm serialization parse date, which we will be using shortly. It's because of the time zone issues, because browser converts every date into your local time zone. So if you need to store UTC dates, it's not very trivial, because it always converts to this zone. So we are not using date object in the view model. Basically, we take the date and serialize it as a string and work with it in the view model as with a string. It's much more stable. There's no automatic conversions, nothing like that. So that's why before you write it to the view model, be sure to call serialize date. And this parameter says if you want to convert into UTC or keep it as is. So I'm saying keep it as is. I want the numbers the user actually wrote in the or selected in the calendar. I need these numbers to be persisted. So whatever is reading this value, they will see the same numbers as the user saw on this screen. And then I need to dispatch the change event, because if there is something bound in the onChange, I want it to be triggered. So I'm calling element.dispatch event, and I'm passing a new change event. This will basically invoke the code in the onChange attribute. This is the standard HTML way how to do it. Yeah. So we have this case when the user selects the date, it's covered, because we will, if it's possible to write it in the view model, we will do it. And also I have saved this instance of the picker in the element, so later I can find it there. So we can do this whenever the value gets updated. And remember, this is also called after the first init, because we didn't set the value to the picker yet, but we will be doing it now. So we'll retrieve this picker from the element, because it should be there. And the important thing in the update handlers, you always or almost always want to call ko unwrap and call the value accessor. If you don't do that, Knockout will figure out, okay, this binding handler maybe doesn't need this value. So if you don't call this, Knockout will decide that, okay, this code wasn't using this value, so let's not watch for the notification. So if the date would be changed and you wouldn't call this, you would not be subscribed to the notifications from that object. So be sure, unless you have very special circumstances, always call ko unwrap value accessor and evaluate that, because otherwise the update will not be called when the property is going to change. Yeah. Normally, if it's bound through the view model, the value should be string, so I will parse it into the date object, but it can happen that it's something else, so I'm trying to be pretty defensive there. If somebody manages to bind any different values, let's not do anything, or so I don't want this binding handler to crash. So if it's string, I will parse it. If it's and to the value of date, and if it's date, I will set it to the picker. Otherwise, I will clear the picker, because I don't know what to do with any other value than date. Only if it's string, I'm able to parse it. So that's basically how this handler is implemented. So basically in the init, you need to initialize the plugin and watch for the events. And typically you will be watching for changes and writing them to the view model. And in the update, you are doing the opposite thing. If the value in the view model changes somehow, you need to update the component. Yeah, so this is the other way around. Yeah, so that's how this is implemented. So when I now run the application, you will see that I can select values and everything should work. So now I can select a value, it was selected here, and it was also written here, and my change handler is called. Whenever I change value here, it will also be like reflected in the other component. Yeah, so it's quite nice, quite easy to integrate. This Easepick control has many other features I haven't been showing and I haven't been implementing, like there is a support for date time. So if you need the user to select the date time, the time values also, you can enable this plugin with this syntax. And also it's very nice to use ranges. So for example, if you want like to have two components and want the user to select range of dates, this is the plugin you want. So you can try it to integrate this component by yourself. It requires some JavaScript or TypeScript, but it's not that difficult. Basically, I have installed like this esbuild and .vvm types, no-code types, and TypeScript. And because this package also contains the TypeScript definitions, they are bundled in this package. It's quite easy to use. The last trick I haven't shown, if you want to use .vvm types, you must specify this section type roots and include whatever starts with types, like add types, and also .vvm types. I hope this tutorial was useful for you. I would be happy to answer questions under the video. Make sure to subscribe our channel and see you next time at DotVVM Minutes.